So I was born in southern China, near Hong Kong, and then at the age of 4, I moved to Canada, and I grew up in Toronto until I was about 24. Then I moved to the United States to do my PhD at Princeton. Spent about close to 6 years there, and did some internships in Germany while I was a student there. And then my first real non-academic job was in Singapore. Spent about close to 2 years in Singapore. Then I moved to New York, spent about 4 years in New York. Then after that I went to Dubai, spent 5.5 years there, and then most recently I've been in Montreal for the last year and a half. I've always been interested in languages, even as a young child, but growing up in Toronto, I didn't get a chance to really explore my passion for languages. I was a poor immigrant household, so we didn't go on many vacations or have those kind of opportunities. But I was always interested in languages, always wanted to go travel the world and learn. And it was only after really leaving Toronto that I had the opportunity to really start learning languages and just immersing myself in my passion for travel and for learning about cultures. And in fact, a lot of the languages that I do speak now all came at a much later age in my life. So proving the fact that you can teach an old dog new tricks. I think languages are very important because not only does it empower you in the sense that you are able to communicate with more people, but it opens up many more doors to being able to be more empathetic to other people, other cultures, because there's so much that you gain through languages which you can't get just through translation. Once you have a language, it allows you to socialize, it allows you to understand how other people think, and it's all very connected to all the other things that I have a passion for. So, I'm very interested as an economist in things such as migration, and such as income inequality, and in such as mobility. And when you study languages and you have an opportunity to use the languages to communicate with a wide audience, it really gives a better perspective on the way that you're analyzing problems. I created the Power Language Index specifically to come up with an answer to this kind of question. And what the Power Language Index does is it comes up with a very neutral perspective on what are the most effective languages, right? So obviously for someone who's living in Montreal, French is going to be very important, and obviously English as well. For someone who's living in Mexico, obviously Spanish and in English. Someone living in China, they'll have a different perspective. What the Power Language Index does is it comes up with a quantifiable measure of what are the important languages to know if someone were to just drop down on Earth, if an alien were to come down to Earth and wanted to communicate and participate in the global economy as much as they could. When I created the Power Language Index, the power is in reference to the ability to communicate with the most number of people, to participate in as much of the economy as possible, to be able to interact with as many people as possible, to consume as much media and knowledge as is possible. So that's really about which languages are powerful, is which languages gives you the most opportunities to do all these kind of things. I think the impact that having languages, besides the obvious ones, is that your brain changes when you learn other languages. And so you really get more empathy, and you really learn much more about a culture when you know the language and when you can partake in conversations with people in their natural setting. And I think that's one of the great things about being multilingual. And like I said, this for me has helped inform me in my research, because it gives me a very different perspective when I look at problems, because being multilingual, your brain actually does function differently when you're working in a different language. Well, the languages that have been most useful to me in my life, obviously is English. English is really, in my own research, the Power Language Index has shown, it's really become a global lingua franca. And so, you can travel pretty much anywhere in the world nowadays and actually be able to communicate in English to a good, portion of the people. Now, some of the other languages that have been really very useful to me, have been, my native Cantonese and also French. Now, native Cantonese has been very effective for me, because if you go anywhere in the world, there's probably a Chinatown in most major cities around the world. And just through that, you can go to almost any place in the world with a big city, and there will be a subpopulation that you can communicate with. Likewise, I found French have been very useful. I used to work in policy, and one of the things that's really interesting is that French retains a very high position in policy circles. So when you look at all the global organizations, FIFA, the BIE, the Bureau of International Exposition, the Olympic movement, a lot of these entities I've worked with in the past, and for them, French is an official language for all these entities. In fact, it has a co-status with English in the sense that all of the major international organizations use both English and French pretty much as their official working languages. Now, obviously, English has become more dominant, but French has still retained that status. And what's very interesting about French nowadays is because of the fact that English has become almost an expected language of everyone to speak on a global level, one way to distinguish yourself and differentiate yourself on the global stage is also to add in your French language skills. And when you look at, like I say, a lot of the global organizations, they also tend to be in places where French is used, in Geneva, in Brussels, in Montreal as well, and Paris. So I think those languages have been very important. I've also picked up German and Russian, and those I've also found to be very useful. German, just because they are very prolific travelers. So anytime you travel in the world, there's a good chance that you'll come across German tourists. And I think Russian has been very helpful to me because I've learned to read the Cyrillic alphabet. And outside of Russia, there are many other places that use the Cyrillic alphabet, including many of the former Soviet communist countries, and also places like Mongolia, which actually use the Cyrillic alphabet. So even as I am not able to understand the words, I can actually read them out and pronounce the words that are written in Mongolian, even if I don't understand them. Mandarin is according to my Power Language Index, the second most influential language. And it's not a big surprise in the sense that, it's 800 million native speakers, and it's the official language, for China. So it's going to be a very powerful language and growing in power as China, becomes or already has become a global economic power, but it's expected to, grow even more in the next little while. And in fact, most estimates put that China, the size of the Chinese economy will surpass the US economy in about 10 or 15 years. So I think the importance of Mandarin will only grow in the future. And I think it's very important, for people nowadays to start, learning, Mandarin now, because it's going to be, really the next, kind of very important language on the global stage. I'm doing quite a bit of research on patterns of employment and mobility and migration status. I'm trying to link all these back to languages as well, because they all interplay into the ability for people to migrate across borders, and how well they integrate, into the new societies, and and how they perform in terms of their earnings potential, etc. And so I'm doing some research over there, and in particular, I'm looking at the Canadian job market as well, seeing how different communities perform in the Canadian job market and whether we can explain it also, with language. So one thing that's really interesting is when you look at the Canadian job market, we don't see in corporate Canada a lot of ethnic Chinese people who are being appointed in corporate level appointments. And so the real question is whether or not ethnic Chinese are going into fields that are not typically corporate, so maybe they're going to pharmacy or being doctors, which you won't see these quote-unquote corporate announcements on Bay Street, and or maybe possibly is also that there may be some discrimination or bias, in which case, if there is, I want to see if they are, for instance, going to find their success possibly in Hong Kong or Shanghai, in which case, how much is that hurting the Canadian economy that you are having these people who, for whatever reason, are going elsewhere to pursue their careers.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
People want to add?
Anything I want to add? I think multilingualism is very important. I think there will be some very interesting challenges going forward, with the with the rise of real-time translation devices. But one of the things that's really going to be interesting to see is, like I said, how these real-time translation devices play into our society. But I think that those who are worried that these devices will kind of overtake the role of translators and maybe make people lazy to learn new languages is that, Google and the internet hasn't made people smarter. It's made people, given them much more access to information, but it actually hasn't made people better researchers per se. And I think likewise with these translation devices, which I think very soon we will have these real-time devices, it's not going to make people any more empathetic to other cultures. It may be able to allow them to read text much more quickly and have it translated in their language, but it will not give them that insight that learning languages enables you to have about different cultures. And so I think in that sense, it's going to be very interesting to see how that technology, which I think is just around the corner, how it will play. One very interesting example is when you look at watches, right? So the Swiss watches still tend to be the gold standard in terms of what people want to own, even though they are very inaccurate. So you can buy a quartz watch for $10, and it tells you much better time than a Swiss watch, which will cost you $20,000, and which is typically off by tens of seconds a day. And I think to a certain extent, I think people who are working in languages will probably need to evolve with the times, where they do kind of take that approach where they go with the time, and even though there will be these real-time translation devices, there will definitely be a need and a yearning to still know a language off the top of your heart and to be immersed in it rather than just relying on machines.